We're going to look at a question, a typical essay question on 2.6.3, which is supply side policies, in this video. Let's go through the case study. We've got some data given to us in figure 1. We're given the rates of inflation over time and measured by RPI and CPI. We can see that CPI for a sustained period of time in 2008 does creep above the 2% target set by the Bank of England, and it does peak at around 5% in quarter 3 of 2008. And then it does begin to slow down. Be careful, inflation does not fall as measured by CPI during this period. From 2008 quarter 3 onwards, it just slows down. So prices are still rising, but at a slower rate. Whereas RPI during 2009, for the most of 2009, actually RPI decreases, so it actually falls. We've got deflation occurring. So we've got disinflation here, we've got deflation, and then we've got inflation occurring there. So we can use that later on to support the view in terms of which supply side policy we go with to address the question. We're also given this table. This table shows annual changes in GDP, so it's in percentage terms, and we're looking at annual percentage change by country, given Germany, UK, US, and then we've got a grouping of developing economies, and that will be countries like China, India, Nigeria, Turkey, Indonesia grouped together. So that's the average of those developing economies. But you can see that for Germany, there's been a slowdown of GDP in 2008. Be careful, that's not a fall in GDP because it's still positive. The UK has also slowed down at a faster pace than Germany. Again, hasn't fallen, positive. But then in 2009, Germany, UK and US, all three experienced a contraction in GDP of different magnitudes. And developing economies, they continue to slow down. In 2010, we're given some forecast figures which help us predict whether this trend is likely to continue or whether there's going to be a change in the fortunes of these countries. Be careful though, it's great EV for you later on. This data here is only a forecast, and you can always question the validity of that information. We're also given an extract with some text, and obviously you'll have read through this previously. I'll also make this available to you in order for you to refer to later on. But there are three main problems that are highlighted within the UK economy that the question wants us to address. So let's move on to the question. We'll come back to those three problems in a moment. The question assess the effectiveness of supply side measures that the government could use to deal with the problems outlined in paragraphs 3, 4 and 5 of extract 1. So these are the three problems I spoke about earlier. We're going to come back to those, and then we're going to look at possible policies that the government could use in order to address those problems that have been outlined. So we've got to answer the question quite specifically. So let's go and have a look at the three problems then. So the three problems that we've been asked to look at as part of the case study. The first problem is that we are suffering with high levels of unemployment, and we've got labour market failure there. So this is largely due to the recession, contraction in the economy, slowdown of growth, and therefore the large number of people that are out of work. We've got more people looking for work than there are vacancies available, so we've got this mismatch, and therefore we've got labour market failure. The second problem that were highlighted in the case study for us is that firms are struggling to raise finance to invest in new or additional capital, and that's quite important. That's a really important point for looking at the benefits of supply side policies, is the ability to extend LRAS outwards and achieve long run growth. So because they're struggling to raise money, they don't have the funds available to invest in new capital to replace old capital, and they don't have the funds available to add any more capital to their existing stock, increase their productive capacity, and obviously enable them to increase the amount that they can supply. The final problem in the case study highlighted is the idea of falling productivity. So that's covering both labour and capital productivity due to less innovation. Now, firms are innovating less because they've got to streamline their businesses, they've got to reduce waste, they've got to save money in order to survive during the recession. There's been a slowdown in consumer expenditure, there's been a fall in confidence in the economy, so firms will always cut back on innovation. Now, don't forget, we've also got labour productivity focused on here because When firms invest in training for their labour, that increases their productivity, increases their output per hour worked, for example, and therefore means that their average cost will decrease and they can produce more in the same time period. So these are three problems that we've got to address. There are two types of supply side policies, and these are the ways that we're going to address these problems. The first set that we could use could be market-based supply side policies. So this is when the government doesn't directly intervene, it intervenes in the running of the market to address those imbalances that exist. Or the second method could be that actually they do take an interventionist role directly, and they can use interventionist supply side policies. So what we're going to do next, we're going to look at different market-based supply side policies that the government could use, and we'll come back to interventionists. The first one they could use would be to actually reduce income tax and or corporation tax, and by doing that they can release more funds and make more funds available for firms to be able to invest in innovation, and then also there'll be increased demand for goods and services, which means that people can go, more people will be demanded in terms of workers as well. The second measure they can take, the second supply side policy could be deregulation. This is reducing rules and laws that firms have to abide by, and by them doing so, this will reduce the burden and costs for firms, making more funds available for other things. The third supply side policy they could go with, I'm just going to move these up a little bit. The third supply side policy they could go with could be to actually abolish national minimum wage and or living wage, and also look at trade union power. And all of these would mean that firms could now pay labour lower wages, and the ability of trade unions to bid up and bargain up wages would be reduced significantly, thereby reducing costs for firms. And the final market-based supply side policy I want to focus on is this idea that they could encourage free trade. They could look at actually if that growth is not coming within the UK. Remember from the data we're given that developing economies such as China, India, Turkey, they're all growing at a faster rate. They've got higher rates of economic growth than the UK. Maybe the best solution would be to look at encouraging more free trade with other countries around the world, and that will enable us to have more economic growth and get more people back into work. So they're the four market-based supply side policies we could have looked at. On the other side, we've got interventionist supply side policies. So I've highlighted two that I think you could have gone with. Number one, obviously spending more money on education and training. That's a real win in terms of the long run, in the long run, because you'll have a much better skilled workforce in the future, increase the human capital. Or secondly, we could see if the government are able to increase their spending on infrastructure projects such as the HS2, which you're all familiar with. So any kind of infrastructure spending creates jobs in the economy, it boosts economic growth, it can create more optimism and confidence about the future, and thereby enabling more economic growth in the private sector later on. Okay, so let's move on to your KAAs and your EVs. So the first KAA, the first problem that I've highlighted, I've chosen to focus on, is this idea that we've got high unemployment. And my solution to combating high unemployment is that actually I would suggest that the government should increase their spending on education and training. So this is an interventionist supply side policy. And your KAA, really, it needs to focus on two main parts. First of all is, well, how is your policy going to work? How will it operate? And I'll talk you through what happens, and I'll change the reason. So first of all, we're going to increase the human capital of those who are unemployed. We're going to take those people who are looking for work, who are actively seeking and willing and able at the current wage rate, and we're going to say, we will help you increase your human capital, we'll increase your skill level, we'll give you training, and we're going to get you back into work. By offering them that education and training, if they take it up and we're successful in the delivery of that, we're going to increase their skill level. And this is going to increase their ability to transition, change, to work in different industries, different sectors, and even different jobs. So no longer do they have the issue of occupational immobility in labour, because they can overcome that, they can surmount that by increasing their level of education and training. This maintains the discipline of working through training as well in the workplace, and having to wake up each day with a purpose. For example, know that you've got to get up, you've got to go and attend these courses, you've got to go into that training session, you've got some courses that you've got to complete, qualifications you've got to gain. That gives you a sense of purpose. As a result of that, we're going to find that there's going to be increased employment as the unemployed fill vacancies in industries where vacancies exist. So we're now able to match up those people who are out of work with the vacancies that we actually have in our economy. And consequently, those people who do manage to get themselves into work are going to find that their income level increases, and as a result of that, they're going to be able to increase their standards of living due to increased consumption. Okay, and the overall macro impact, the big impact at the end, is that if we get a lot of people increasing their income levels, increasing the skill level of consumption, there's going to be overall increased demand for goods and services. So this is going to increase employment. This is because labour, don't forget, has derived demand. So far, what we've got is a really good argument in terms of the theory of economic models and concepts and how it all works, but we don't have any context to justify and back up our chains of reasoning. And that's what we're going to look at next. So we're going to have a look at what sort of context could you use, and the question to really ask yourself is, everything that I'm suggesting, why is it appropriate in this situation, in this scenario? And these are quotes that I've just taken from the case study, the extract that you've been given as part of the reading for this question. The 2008-2009 financial crisis and recession has similarities to the recessions of the 1920s, 1980s and 1990s. All of those recessions were quite deep, they were quite severe, and the impacts were wide-reaching. So we've got a really tough recession on our hands at the moment. There has been a misallocation of resources in several sectors, meaning people have a skills gap. A skills gap means that the people who are unemployed, who are seeking work at the moment, they don't have the skills to fill the vacancies that currently exist. So we've got an issue, and thereby education and training would be really appropriate in this situation, because we're going to skill up the unemployed, we're going to increase their human capital, we're going to give them those qualifications that they require in order to transition into the vacancies that exist. Now, you don't have to use all of these quotes. I'm just showing you the range of different quotes you could have chosen to support your argument. Long-term unemployment has increased and income inequality has risen. So we've got higher income inequality, that's the gap between those who earn the highest and those who earn the lowest in the UK, has increased. Long-term unemployment is a continuing problem where people suffer with hysteresis, there's a loss of work ethic, they lose the discipline of going to work. So education and training would be a really good way of addressing those issues as well. Residential construction is an example. House building has declined due to a lack of demand, and skilled tradesmen have become unemployed. We've got an issue with people who are bricklayers, carpenters, plumbers even, who would have been working on those new builds, those construction sites, building new houses, and because now there's been a cutback in that sector, they're not building as many houses as they were previously, they just don't require the labour anymore. So those people are out of work. If the private sector, so people in their own homes, don't want those people in to do work at the moment because they're suffering with low optimism, confidence about the future and saving rather than spending, then those people are going to have a real tough time of gaining some meaningful employment. So and maybe the vacancies that exist don't necessarily match the skill set or qualifications that they currently have. So education and training would be a really good way of addressing that and overcoming, surmounting those problems for those people. And finally, a short quote that I found that I think we could also use to bolster the chains of reasoning and give some real good context is that we're told that former employees may lose skills and the discipline of working. So people who are out of work who would have worked previously, they may lose skills because they don't use them anymore, and also they might lose the discipline of working. So this idea of creating a routine, getting up in the morning, going to work, and maintaining that over a period of time as well. So quite a lot of quotes there that you could have used from the case study. Again, all of this has come from the extract. None of this has come from anything beyond. So it's all there. You just had to pick it out, select it, and then use it appropriately. Now, moving on from KAA1, we have to then move on to EV. So we've got our first EV. And remember, EV is all about considering, well, why might this policy not necessarily be as effective as I think it will? Are there any barriers to it being successful? And what are those barriers? So I've got a selection here. I've got 4 potential EVs, and then I show you the one that I decided to go with. So the first barrier is that actually with education and training, it does take a long time before you'll see the impact and the benefits of those. You know, qualifications take time to get to earn. It takes people a long time to gain skills, especially if they're complex skills, to fill complex vacancies that exist in complex industries and sectors. And actually, what if people don't necessarily behave? So we're now moving on to 2. What if people don't necessarily behave the way that we expect them to? What if the people who are unemployed don't actually, take this education and training on positively? What if they don't buy into it? What if they don't want to do this? Can we force them into it? Is that appropriate? And even if they do take on the skills that we ask them to, what if they do complete the education, complete the training? If the economy has moved on since then, and now vacancies that exist have moved on as well, then actually their skill level may not match the vacancies that exist at that time period, because it's a dynamic thing that we're dealing with, the economy. And finally, I've put geographical immobility with a question mark. Are people going to be able to get to where these jobs and these vacancies exist, even once they've got the qualifications required of them? Are they going to be able to move to that area? Are house prices in that area affordable? Is it possible for them to use public transport? Are they going to be able to go by private transport? And is there adequate infrastructure to be able to support all of that? The context for your first EV is that we could have spoken about a number of things. I decided to go with how it always depends on how they fund the program, okay? Because we know that global output is on a persistently lower path than expected before the crisis, and public finances are severely weakened. And that word severely in the extract shows the severity. It really is quite significant in building a picture of how bad this recession is and how bad the government's tax revenue situation is. How are they going to fund this? Are they going to cut back on other departments, other spending? Are they going to increase their borrowing? Are they going to increase taxation? What is the decision going to be? And with every decision that's taken, there will always be an opportunity cost. What have they actually had to sacrifice now or in the future for potential generations later on? Now, moving on to KAA2, we've got to now deal with, so we dealt with one of the problems that I highlighted, we've got to deal with a second problem. And the second problem that I've highlighted is that actually firms are really struggling to invest, and whether that be in labour or whether that be in capital. So they're struggling to invest in capital and labour. So my solution is a market-based supply-side policy, well, interventionist this time, and I decided that actually the best solution to that would be to reduce corporation tax. Remember, corporation tax is what firms pay on their profits. So if we allow them to keep more of their profits, that's called retained profit. If they retain more of their profit, then they're going to have more money available to them. So let's go through our chains of reasoning and how we're going to structure those for this KAA. So how's it going to work? Well, reducing corporation tax means that the tax burden on firms is reduced and they increase their retained profit. By increasing their retained profit, they're able to increase the funds that they've got available for investing, so we're here now, into new or additional capital or even worker training. This will increase the UK's productive capacity and it will extend LRAS outwards, which will enable us to achieve more short-run growth, that's AD shifting to the right, without causing high rates of inflation or high inflationary pressure. Okay. As another little note as well, don't forget that increasing productivity will also reduce average costs for firms, making UK exports more internationally competitive, meaning that actually that might also fuel some more rises in AD. The diagram that we would ideally like to see as part of your analysis for this KAA would look like this. Okay, so what we've got here is original LRAS, our original YFE, and we look for macro equilibrium, which is where AD intersects LRAS, and that position is called Y, and our price level is PL. So we're operating at Y with a price level of PL, and then we extend our LRAS outwards through the impact of our supply side policy by reducing corporation tax. Firms invest more, that increases their productive capacity, and it shifts the whole LRAS curve outwards to the right for the whole country. By doing so, we can actually enable the country to increase short-run growth, AD shifts to the right, and we can do that without causing high inflationary pressure, which occurs at the end of the bottleneck and on the perfectly inelastic part of the LRAS curve. So we can now see that we've got an increase in AD, it shifts right from AD to AD1, and we've actually got an increase in national output and economic growth from Y to Y1, and that means that the price level actually is slowed down or decreased to PL1 depending on what the numbers suggest we're at. Okay, so we now got the ability to achieve even more economic growth without running up the bottleneck and getting to a period of high inflation or even hyperinflation. So that's the diagram that we would use with that KAA. So the context for the second KAA, we've got a few bits of information here to run through. Why is it appropriate? Again, we've got to justify why it would be appropriate for us to consider reducing corporation tax in this situation. Research by the IMF into previous recessions found a lack of investment prevented economies rebounding to their pre-crisis trends of output. So this is really valuable. This is a real golden nugget of information that's going to benefit you and really bolster your analysis, because you're able to specifically cite the IMF and say, well, look, this is a credible agency, the International Monetary Fund. They are telling us that if we can support firms to invest more money, we're going to have a really good chance of rebounding and achieving that economic growth that the government is desperate to achieve for the betterment of everyone in society. A second quote from the case study in the extract that I found that I think you could use for this as well is, companies struggle to invest in viable and innovative projects because banks restrict credit to protect their finances. So we know that the global financial crisis happened initially in the banking sector, and then it rippled out into other parts of the economy. So banks during that time period were really restrictive about who they were lending to, and they wanted a high level of security. They wanted really high chance of probability that they're going to get the money back. So a lot of firms struggled to borrow during that situation, during that time period. So maybe this again helps us justify that by reducing corporation tax, the government is indirectly giving money to firms in order to say, well, here you go, this is how you can fund your investment, your innovation, whether that be in training or in capital, and let's get the economy back to where it needs to be in the long run. A third quote that you could have used is that actually productivity falls because there is less innovation as R&D spending tends to be scaled back in bad times. Again, this is another quote from the IMF, so it's got some real credibility behind it, and this helps justify the idea that actually if we don't do something to increase innovation, then we're going to be stuck in this recession for longer than we need to, and we really want to get out of it as quickly as possible. And we know that firms will cut back on R&D, and then the effects are felt on productivity and average cost and our international competitiveness. So actually the best thing to do would be to support those firms to invest by looking at policies such as reducing corporation tax. Then the final part of our essay would be to look at EV. So I've got 4 potential EVs, EV2 here. Again, time and behaviour comes into that. So we know that reducing corporation tax today will reduce corporation tax revenue for governments in the medium term, but actually to really see them invest and then bring that investment to fruition, it's going to take a long time to see the impact. So it could be 18 months, it could be 2 years before you realistically feel the benefits of any cut in corporation tax feeding through into investment in the economy. Secondly, firms, well, are they definitely going to invest that money into new capital, additional capital, or training for their workforce? What if they just choose to pay that out to shareholders? What if they choose to save that away in case their finances worsen because optimism is low at the moment? And will the government really be able to cope with reducing that tax revenue? What's the opportunity cost of giving that corporation tax cut away? If that means that we've got less tax revenue for the government overall, then are they going to borrow to cover the shortfall and maintain public sector spending? Are they going to increase taxes in other sectors of the economy? What are they going to do? And finally, the success of investment projects is quite low actually. I haven't got any specific figures for you at this point, but it is a very high chance that any investment projects run by firms don't always bring about the exact return that they expect. So a lot of them will return efficiency savings that are far less than predicted, or increases in productivity that are far below that were predicted. So there's a real question mark over how successful investment projects tend to be when you make funds available for this. Okay. Now the final part to our essay would be to look at some contextual evidence to support our EV2. So Germany, the UK and the USA all contracted by between 2.4% and 5% in 2009. That's taken from the table in figure 2. This contraction of AD is likely to result in significant spare capacity. So remember, we call that a negative output gap. When we're operating below YFE, we've got spare capacity in the economy, suggesting that actually if we're operating below full capacity, why would firms spend money on increasing productive capacity at a time when they've currently got the ability to meet that extra demand that they might experience from future economic growth? And therefore it questions the viability of our supply side policy. This brings the essay plan to a conclusion. I hope you found this useful.